back. NASA is predicting the next solar cycle will be the lowest in 200 years, called the Dalton minimum. Those are very low levels of solar cycle activity. Sunspots now being recognized more and more as indicating all sorts of things in terms of impacting our climate and solar activity as we notice it and feel it. There haven't been any new sunspots sighted, I think, in about 50 days now. It's a long time. The grand solar minimum is gaining more and more support all the time. This is a big story. The sun affects everything. And Spencer Feldman wrote me a note saying that he was studying this quite a bit, and it might make a good topic for a program. Spencer, welcome back. Thanks for being here.
Hey, Jeff. Nice to be on your show again. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. This link, click on anything under Spencer's name, and I linked it to a story from Electroverse, just put up today. I think it was, well, anyway, it's a news story. And I quoted a little bit from that, but I would like you to do, if you go to that link, scroll down and look on the right side. You'll see a picture. It says latest Arctic sea ice thickness, latest Greenland ice sheet, and blah, blah, blah. Then you'll see the fifth one down. It's latest sunspot numbers through November 2019. Click on that graph. Latest sunspot activity. Take a look at where things have been since 2018, moving on to where we are now. That is a flat line blue sitting on 0 on the bottom for much of 2019. It's right there. Spencer, what got you interested in this, and what kinds of things can we expect if the situation continues for much longer like this?
Well, let's kind of start at the beginning for people who this may be new information to.
Yeah.
Okay. So according to NASA, based on what the sun is doing, we're heading for a repeat of the terrible winters and crop failures of the early 1800s. And the main player in this, the driver of it, is sunspots, or the lack of them. Now, sunspots are usually found in pairs. They're dark areas in the photosphere of the sun caused by magnetic flux. They were first written about in the Chinese Book of Changes in 800 BC, and occasionally they can even be seen with the naked eye. But, of course, nowadays you'd look at them through a telescope with a filter.
Sure.
Now, you mentioned the sunspot cycle. What it is there's an 11.4-year cycle, roughly, yeah. And that means that for a few years, the number of sunspots increase, they become more frequent, and they max out, usually at about 100 in a year, but sometimes 200. It depends on the year, right? And then they start coming down again, and then you could get down to maybe 20. So depending on, what's going on, you go from around 20 sunspots spots per year to about 100 and change, and it goes like that. Sometimes we get a few cycles in a row where there's a lot more sunspots than normal. That's called a solar maximum. And you might get a few in a row where there's not quite so many, and that's called a solar minimum. And this happens every couple of 100 years. It's not like clockwork, but it definitely has a rhythm to it. And when we get these 2 or 3 cycles or more, 6 cycles in a row where they're either very high or very low, we call them grand solar maximums or grand solar minimums. And this is what NASA's talking about. They think we're headed into another grand solar minimum. Now, you mentioned earlier that sunspots have a great effect on the planet, and we're really just starting to understand how much they control. Weather, agriculture, politics, even our health. So let's first talk about the solar maximum, and then we can talk about the solar minimum, which is where we think we're headed.
Let me remind everyone to hit that link under Spencer's name and scroll down, look on the right-hand side for the graph. It's the 5th graphic on the right. I think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6th graphic on the right. Latest sunspot number count through November 2019. Click on that, and that's a very good reference point. You can see where it is right now. It's flatlined at the bottom. Flatline on 0. That's wild. Go ahead, Spencer.
Right, and we'll talk a little bit about, in a little bit later, we'll talk about how statistically abnormal that is. It's not terrible, but it's we'll get into a little bit more of what that means historically. Mm-hmm. So the solar maximum gives us stable weather and good crops, but it also tends to make us a bit more manic as a species and increases autoimmune diseases. You can see this play out historically as an increase in war, genocide, massacres, and general craziness. Think of Aztec sacrifices and witch hunts and the Spanish Inquisition and the Nazi rise to power. These are the kinds of things that are more likely to happen during solar maximums. And you could even say the witch hunts still go on. In 1947, we had the McCarthy era. That was a witch hunt. And I would even say that the rise of political correctness is a kind of witch hunt now that we're experiencing or have been.
That's a good way to look at it, political correctness.
Right.
I agree. Yeah.
Right, and think of it, in the human body you get autoimmune reactions from the sunspots, and well, what is a witch hunt? That's a political autoimmune reaction. And what is a war? That's an autoimmune reaction at a species level. That's people attacking people.
It is.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's whether it's the tribe attacking the widow and calling her a witch, or whether it's the nation attacking another nation, it's still we're attacking ourselves. It's autoimmune, if you want to think of it in as
chronic fatigue syndrome is supposedly an autoimmune disorder. I don't know how that's affected by solar maximums and minimums, but it could be. It's still not diagnosable easily. People just have terrible physical symptoms and problems, but there's not an easy marker to look at to determine if somebody formally has CFS, chronic fatigue syndrome.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, we know, for instance, that MS doubles for people that were born in high sunspot times. So it definitely affects us. Now, what we're talking about today is the solar minimum. This is less sunspots. Now, there are some good things that come with solar minimums. Culture flourishes, philosophy, reason, human rights blossom, IQ goes up. So consider the last 3 solar minimums that we've had. We had, the spore minimum. That was 1400s to 1600s. That gave us the Renaissance. We saw blossoming of classical philosophy and literature and art. The Maunder minimum was 1645 to 1715, something like that. That was giving us the Age of Enlightenment, right? The century of philosophy. And the Dalton minimum, which NASA is saying is coming our way, we got the first industrial revolution, steam power, and the cotton gin. So it's not all doom and gloom. We somehow managed as a species not to blow ourselves up with nuclear weapons during the last solar maximum that we've been in this last century. And I like to think that if we do enter a solar minimum, for all the weather problems it's going to cause, maybe we've made it out of this manic phase of war and just kind of general craziness. Now, on the downside, the global solar minimum creates major climactic and agricultural problems. And this is how some scientists think it happens. It's a little technical, but we can do it. So the sun has a field around it called the heliosphere. And it's kind of this large energetic sphere that kind of comes out and surrounds and protects the solar system. And it protects us from cosmic rays coming from outside the solar system.
So, question. The Spencer, this is important. The heliosphere extends that far out in a perfect radius around the sun that it includes us in it and protects us from cosmic radiation to a degree? That's how big the heliosphere is? Okay, well, that's what I was trying to get at.
It goes past the Earth, right? But it's not, but it's not the same size all the time. So cosmic rays are poorly named because they're not rays. They're particles. They're called relativistic particles. They're usually protons moving at close to the speed of light, and they're created by things like supernova and other violent cosmic events. So, the galaxy is awash with these particles zipping by. We call them cosmic rays, and some of them actually come from outside our own galaxy. And normally, when there are sunspots and the sun is active, the heliosphere is large, and it's a shield. It buffers us from these cosmic rays. But during a global solar minimum, the heliosphere shrinks, and it means that more cosmic rays can hit our planet.
Got it.
Now, when they hit our planet, several things happen. First is they hit the atmosphere and they kind of disintegrate into subatomic particles, but what they do is they create clouds. So the first thing that happens in a global solar minimum is you get more cloud cover, which means the Earth tends to get less light, it cools off, and you get less evaporation from the oceans, so you end up with droughts. Then when it finally does rain, it's torrential, so you also get more storms and more hail. So there's that weather getting a little wonky. Drought, drought, and then a downpour and a flood, and then more drought. The other thing it does is it decreases the ozone layer. This allows more ultraviolet into the atmosphere, which is not good for plants because it burns the plants and, more sunburns for us. But it also can heat the upper atmosphere, and that's what causes the polar vortex to shift. So normally you've got all this really cold wind, air, circling around the poles of the planet. But when the other atmosphere heats up, it can tilt the polar vortex, and that's when you get these, suddenly 30-degree drop in temperature storms that are will suddenly drop on, say, the North American continent or Europe, something like that.
Right. Now, you mentioned that the ultraviolet radiation increases. I'm getting reports from people that ultraviolet B, which is the burning ray that gives you that kind of reddish tan, not orange like Trump, gives you the sunburn, UVB. Tanning salons carefully regulate them. Usually 4 to 6% of the light you're in is UVB. That's ideal for getting a quick surface tan. We're getting reports now that some of the UVB readings are in the 40s, not the normal 6 to 8, 40s. So that's indicative that something's thinning up there for sure.
Right. So the last thing, there's more, there's many things I'm sure we don't know that the cosmic rays do, but the last thing that we think that they're doing is these particles, they also get into the Earth's crust, also known as the lithosphere, and they can trigger earthquakes and volcanoes. Now, how this happens is, up for debate. Personally, I think that the electrical charge, how do I say this? Okay, so if you have a quartz watch in your hand, it works because when you vibrate quartz, it gives off an electric signal. It's called a piezoelectric effect. Well, that effect can go backwards. It can reverse. If you put an electrical signal into a crystal, it'll vibrate. Now, there's a lot of quartz in the lithosphere. So my theory is that, when we charge at the lithosphere with all this, all these cosmic rays, it kind of causes the rocks to start to move more, and then that's where you get the earthquake. Water is released from the great, water storage places in the earth, hits the hot magma, increases in volume 1,600 times, and boom, you've got a volcano. Now, there was...
that's a very good supposition, by the way. It makes sense. That's why there's been a rather substantial increase in earthquakes and volcanism all around the Pacific Ring, especially. So, it makes sense.
Well, and you also end up getting a lot more lightning. So we've had some bad burning in this country the last year or two, California and all these fires. if we continue to go into a global solar minimum, we should expect more drought, lower surface humidity, which means there won't be dew feeding the plants and everything gets drier, and then more lightning. So we might see a lot more fires. But
big fires in Australia right now, as you know, for weeks now. And some of the recent lightning storms have reportedly had phenomenal numbers of lightning bolts, like 30,000, in a matter of minutes, that kind of thing. Crazy.
Wow. Well, we're starting to see this. So let's talk about, in 1816, this is the Dalton minimum, which is what NASA says we're headed towards. This was also known as 1800 and froze to death, or the year without a summer. And the global solar minimum of that time triggered the supervolcano Mount Tambora. And the dust that it sent around the world and the sulfur that got into the atmosphere and reflected the solar radiation created a volcanic winter on top of the global solar minimum. So what we had was worldwide crop failures and famine. And I think grain prices went up sevenfold that year.
Well, the year without a summer. We have, because of the rains, suffered tremendous agricultural losses in the American Midwest that people just don't even know about because it's not in the media. Food prices this winter are going to go up. You'll watch. Corn wasn't planted, so all kinds of crops were lost over vast areas of the Midwest because of the incredible inundation of those areas with rain. They were just dunked on this summer.
I don't know if it's true or not, but I heard that the Chinese bought out Kazakhstan for 5 years, paid in advance for all of their crops. That's a country that neighbors China. And the Chinese have been around for 5,000 years. If you're going to be around for 5,000 years, you have to be able to play, you have to have forward thinking. There's one other thing that may make this particular global solar minimum a little bit more dicey than normal. Our solar system is moving into something called the void. It's a section of space where the amount of dust and hydrogen atoms are much less dense. So our whole solar system is moving into a place with higher levels of cosmic radiation. And some people have said that 3 of our shields are down, meaning the dust that the solar system travels through is decreasing. That would be our first shield against cosmic rays. The heliosphere is down, and then the Earth's magnetic field is down. So that could make this a little bit more intense. So during a global solar minimum, because of these extra things coming in, we get more mutations, more heart attacks, more birth defects, and more cancer. So the question is, where are we in all this? You can look back a couple of 100 years, because this is really all we have data for, and you can get a sense of what kind of patterns are possible. Now, the last solar cycle, number 24, was pretty low. There was not that many sunspots. So the question is, what's the next one going to do? So NASA is predicting a replay of the Dalton minimum. This is when, for the 1800s, when food prices went up 7 times and you had the year without a summer. That was 3 solar cycles with very low sunspots. So if NASA is right, if they're being straight with us, then over the next 33 years, we might have 3 sets of 3 years, the minimums, with just really bad crops. And what would that mean to 1 billion people living on $1 a day? Right now, the average American family spends 10% of its disposable income on food. What happens if it goes to 70%? That's going to be tough.
Right.
A lot of suffering. Now, on the other hand, there's a very famous solar physicist, a Russian named Valentina Zarkova, who is arguably the world expert on the sun. And she says we are actually headed into a repeat of the Maunder minimum of the 1600s. And this is based on her understanding of how the dynamos of the sun are going in and out of phase, and technically it was beyond my ability to follow what she was talking about. Mm-hmm. But during the Maunder minimum of the 1600s, it was quantitative and qualitatively different from the Dalton minimum. The Dalton minimum was 3 cycles that were dampened. We still had cycles. They were just very small. In the Maunder minimum, there were 70 years with almost no spots at all, virtually flatlined. The sun
70 years.
Basically didn't cycle. 70 years, 6 cycles. Now, a repeat of the Maunder minimum, that's a game changer at the level of a civilization, because having something like that happen in the 1600s, when 95% of the population grows their own food, is one thing. Having it happen where 95% of the population live in megacities or in major cities and don't know how to grow food even if they wanted to is a whole different ball of wax. So the question is, who's right? Is it NASA or the Russian expert? And
well, the interesting thing,
so when we get back, we'll talk about how to figure that out.
How do we figure that out? NASA doesn't have the best reputation, let's put it that way, for being square with us all the time. Back with Spencer in just a couple minutes, talking about the sun and our immediate future. Okay, welcome back. Talking with Spencer Feldman about the solar minimum that we are apparently entering. Right now, no sunspots, and they are intricately involved with virtually everything on the planet here. Go ahead, Spencer.
Sure. So, NASA, I'm not convinced that they're being honest with us, because if they thought we were heading into a Dalton minimum and they told us, that's sort of like a run on the bank. You can imagine the kind of, if they thought we were going into a Maunder minimum, I don't think they would tell us, because that would create a run on the bank in a sense. Everyone would rush to the grocery stores and buy food and havoc. So my guess is either, according to their algorithms, they really think it is a Dalton, or they think it's a Maunder, but they can't say anything publicly, and they're just crossing their fingers and hoping it doesn't go that way. If you look at the videos of Valentina Zarkova, and you see the work that she's done already and the predictions that she's made that have already come true, the woman has got credentials and a massive respect on the planet. So I'd probably say that she's the right, more accurate, but how do we know in advance? How do we make intelligent decisions? That was what really got me. I didn't want to be able to look back and say, I should have done this, or I wanted to be able to look forward. So there are various ways that you can gauge what the sun's doing, but after looking at all the technical details, the simplest thing to me is how many days in a row have we gone without a sunspot? I put a little counter on my website, remedylink.com, and every day I update it with how long we've gone. So you can see, if you don't want to dig through all the NASA files, where we're at. So right now we're at day 49. Now, let me put that in perspective. Since 1822, there have only been 4 times we've had a longer stretch than this. So there was a 54-day stretch in 1879, a 69-day stretch in 1901, and in 1913, a 92-day stretch. And then we get to the Dalton minimum, where we had a 40-day stretch, something like that. Right. So right now, at 49 days without a sunspot, we're a statistical outlier. There's only been, a few times it's gone this long, but it's not cause for concern yet. See, it's not yet. It's cause for it's something to pay attention to. So in my mind, I got a couple of lines in the sand. If we get to 100 days in a row without a sunspot, okay, now it's starting to look more likely that the next minimum is going to be pretty bad. And at 140 days, we are basically into the Dalton minimum. So maybe at 100, 120, I might ramp up my perspective on what it is I need to do to change to take care of myself and the people I love. If we get past 140 days, if we get 150, 160, 170, or if we start getting 100-plus days back-to-back. So let's say we go out to 100 days, get 3 sunspots, and then go right into another 100 days, and then another few sunspots. If either of those two things happen, then I think we're in for the Maunder minimum. To give you a sense of that, we had, let's see, 275 days this year without a sunspot. And since 1849, only 1913 had less sunspots than this year. And this year's not even over yet. So,
what was have you studied the weather around 1913, 1914, 1915?
No, I haven't. What is it?
It'd be interesting to look that up. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
If you really want to get into this, I recommend a book called Solar History by Sasha Dobler. And he will go into going thousands of years back, what happened agriculturally, politically, in many different ways as we come in and out of the maximum and minimum. And it's a fascinating read. Okay, so I'm looking at the number of days about the sunspots. And let's say we are headed into the Dalton minimum, right? It means 3 sets of 3 years. And by all means, we shouldn't assume that a Dalton or a Maunder are the only 2 possible outcomes. These are just the ones that we have historical reference to. But there could be different patterns we don't know of. But let's just look at these 2. If we were going into a Dalton minimum, it would mean you store some food, maybe you insulate your home a bit better, buy some winter clothes that might be a bit more heavy duty than you would normally get for the part of the world you live in.
Are we talking about a possible mini ice age here? Is that a possibility?
Well, so the term the Little Ice Age was from the 1600s to the 1800s, and that basically included the Maunder and the Dalton together.
Oh.
Could we go into a complete ice age? Well, sure. But, that's sort of like Yellowstone blowing. Yes, it's going to happen eventually, but will it happen in our lifetime? Probably not.
Right.
But will a solar minimum happen in our lifetime? Very likely it's already starting.
Yeah. Okay.
So let's say we're headed towards the Maunder minimum. This is the much more serious one. This is where
for you listening, that's MAUNDR, Maunder minimum.
I believe, yes, MAUNDER, and that lasted 70 years, and it was basically a flatlining. And so this is where you start thinking, wow, it's like, I'm 51. If it's a Dalton minimum, that will be the rest of my life, right?
Yeah.
But a Maunder minimum is my life, my kids' lives, my grandkids' lives, right? So now it starts, you have to start thinking like, wow, do I need to buy a little spot in the country with some water and some farmland? A Maunder minimum is a much more serious scenario for our planet, and you really have to get your perspective. The perspective you have to take, I think, is intergenerational. And my big advice for if we're going into a Maunder, and let me back up a sec. We could go into what we think is a Dalton, and it becomes a Maunder. We could say, oh, well, look, the solar cycle came back. It was lower, but it came back.
Right.
But that could be how the Maunder starts. So we might have, over the next 11 years, a smaller cycle and think, okay, that's it. It's getting better again. And then it flatlines. So just to be clear, if we have the Dalton, that does not rule out the Maunder. A lower sunspot cycle does not mean that in the next 11 years it doesn't flatline, but at least you get a little bit of time to figure out what you're going to do.
I got it.
And the best advice I can give to anybody if we're heading towards this is grow potatoes. And I'll tell you why. When the weather is great, you can grow the cereals, the rice and corn and soy. Yeah. But if a big hailstorm comes and knocks it all to the ground and it rots on the ground, or if you get a big freeze, it's not. These cereal crops, the grains, and they're really great for the solar maximums. That's the kind of weather they're good for, but they're not good for the solar minimums. In the solar minimums, you want to be growing things under the ground. Potatoes, sweet potatoes, rutabagas, turnips, parsnips, because they are much more resistant to not only storms coming through and knocking things down, but the freezes, because they've got the earth as a heat sink. So one of the things you can see in the minimums is you might get a foot of snow in July. You might find frozen lakes in the middle of summer. And that's the kind of thing that can destroy a harvest. So what we may need to do is to move as a species. We kind of dance with these things. We need to be flexible and say, okay, yes, we've had a great ride. We were able to grow corn and soy and rice and wheat, and now it's over. And now we're going to shift to growing potatoes and other things that grow under the ground, or shifting to things that have shorter growing cycles.
Or move under the ground on a fairly large scale and grow things under the ground. There are stories all over the place of ancient, large caverns and tunnel systems all over the place under the ground. It's suggestive of civilizations that have had use for that in the past. Just a thought.
Yeah. So potatoes, again, my word for the day is potato. A quarter an acre can feed 10 people.
Oh, really?
It's a very easy crop to grow. It's very prolific.
Isn't it just full of starch, though, basically? Or is it?
Well, yes, but it's also got a reasonably balanced. From what I've read, it's got it's got enough protein in it that you could live on potatoes if you had to.
Okay.
So, learning how to grow potatoes, I would suggest go to, there's a YouTube channel, I think it's Hollis and Nancy's Homestead, and they have a video called How to Grow Potatoes in a 5-Gallon Bucket. That's a great place to start. So even if learning how to do this now when it's not stressful and it's fun and you do it with the kids, you make a project out of it. The fact that you and your family are learning how to possibly feed yourselves, they don't have to know that. They just know that you're getting together and you're growing some potatoes in the backyard.
No, very smart.
Yeah, so what can we do, right? We can follow the sunspots. Like I said, on remedylink.com, I keep the sunspot stretch, the running number up there if you don't want to hunt for that data. As the stretch gets longer, consider dollar cost averaging. What I mean by that is, right now you can get 35 pounds of kind of grain and lentil soup mix for about $60 plus shipping from a lot of the storage places. I'm sure you can refer some great ones. Yeah. And so let's say you did that now, right? And every month that we went without a sunspot, you said, I'm going to buy another 2 5-gallon containers. Then, as the price, if it goes up, your dollar cost averaging your cost. I like to think of it as saying that we're about to play a planet-wide game of musical chairs with food, right? And if you knew you were going to be forced to play musical chairs for your life, and the life of those you cared for, the smartest thing, if you had time, was to build your own chairs and bring them with you. So that's the kind of thought I'm thinking, to what degree can we be a little more self-sufficient? So if you live in a city, which most people do, you might consider buying a few months of food that stores well and put it in your closet and forget about it. Because look what's going on in India. They had an onion shortage, and now they're rationed with armed guards in the military to make sure you don't get too much. I don't want to go out. Can you imagine going out and food shopping where every time you went food shopping, there was a military with checkpoints, ration cards, and it was like Black Friday? a little bit of food in your closet might go a long way to protecting your family from that. Now, let's say you don't live in the city. Let's say you live in the suburbs. Well, you might only have a small backyard, but you could get 5-gallon buckets and fill it up with soil, and you could grow some potatoes. That is an easy and inexpensive thing you could do. Think of it as a victory garden, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, if you're a farmer, you could start possibly transitioning into root crops, but if not, let's say you grew corn, right? And now you're used to growing corn that takes 100 days to harvest. Well, there are varieties that only take 60 days, and that might be the difference between a ruined crop and a crop you can take to market.
Right.
You know, Jeff, I'm reminded of this fantastic photo from World War II. It was a bomb crater in London, but it had been turned into a garden. And that gave me so much hope for humanity that they took this symbol, this evidence of destruction and violence, and found a way to turn it into something productive and beautiful.
That's always inspirational, for sure.
Yeah. So, you know, yes, a global solar minimum will be difficult, but, you know, if it is a Dalton, and even if it is the Maunder, it's nothing we can't handle with some forward thinking, some basic preps, a good attitude, you know, like the victory gardens from the World War. And, you know, look at the bright side. Yes, well, we're going to be hungry and cold, but we also may be entering a new age of reason and enlightenment. Who knows what this next minimum might bring forth?
I agree.
A new renaissance.
This also raises a lot of questions about astrophysics. What's going on with the sun? Why does it seem to go to sleep like this? It's just a very big puzzle. We don't have the answers.
One thing you might consider is that if food, one of the things they're going to start doing, unfortunately, as the crops get worse, is they're probably going to be dumping a lot of herbicides and pesticides and fungicides and things like glyphosate on the crops. This is for a number of reasons. Low sunspots make crops weaker, so they're more susceptible. So you need the pesticides and to keep them from being eaten up. The other thing is glyphosate, which is, I think, a pound per person on the planet per year is made, is this toxic herbicide that'll kill virtually anything that's not GMO. And they can spray it onto crops to kill them, and that causes them to dry out so they can harvest them faster. So if a farmer thought that a big storm is coming and they had to get their crop to harvest it sooner, one of the tricks they do is they'll dump glyphosate on it. Then the other thing is the crops can end up being very wet because of the weather, so it requires a massive amount of propane to dry them. So this means propane shortages, which we've already seen in the Midwest. It also means that a lot of the grains are going to get kind of moldy. So the kind of food that will be available, you know, it's going to be a little bit more toxic. We're going to need to do some more detox to kind of stay on top of it. But we have enough heads-up warning, right? We're at day 49 now.
49, yeah.
Right. We could have a sunspot tomorrow, and we've got from now until sometime this spring, summer, before possibly it starts becoming obvious that things are not going to be what we're used to, that these were the good old days, and now we're going to have to tighten the belt. So, you know, we've got plenty of time to start making contingency plans, to start getting some raised beds in your backyard, to start having conversations with your family members saying, hey, I know that we wanted to go on a vacation to Hawaii. I know I promised it, but let's go to the Grand Canyon instead, and instead we'll save some of that money, and we're just going to put a little food away, and we're going to, you know, insulate the attic and get a cast iron stove.
Common sense. This is common sense.
Yeah.
Very good.
And, you know, there's a lot of great places to go to. There's YouTube channels like Ice Age Farmer and Adapt 2030. You can type in global solar minimum. there's a lot of people talking about it. You know, you've got farmers saying this is what's happening to me locally. You've got people on the larger scale talking about what's happening at the planet, you know, in terms of crops around the world and how they're failing. You know, there's a lot of information now that's available. You know, we have an advantage that they didn't have during the Maunder and the Dalton minimums. We can see this one coming, and we can prepare for it.
We have clear notice that something very, very interesting is going on. And it's always smart to prepare. We've been doing this on the program forever, telling people, even if you go to your supermarket and order 4 or 5 cases, 12 cans each, of organic baked beans, buy something that you'll have, and you can rely on that to get by. Because if something does happen, the trucks stop rolling, and that's it. That's it.
You know, if nothing happens, you either eat the food or give it to the local food bank or cycle it through.
That's right.
There's no loss here. You know, the other challenge, you know, is, Jeff, we've got this just-in-time system, which I'm sure, you know, the majority of your listeners know. The trucks roll into Costco. They roll into the grocery stores with that day's food. There isn't 3 days of food sitting there.
No.
The other thing is the U.S. government, I forget which year, gave up its strategic grain reserves. We used to have a massive amount of grains held in reserve in case we got hungry, right? And that got turned into a line statement in an accounting book saying, okay, well, we have money set aside in case we need to get food. But you can't eat money, you know? So we can't rely on the government to say, hey, not a problem. I've put away a couple of years of food for just such an event. That is what good kings of old used to do. They would have the royal granaries, and they would hold stuff and then say, okay, I've been taxing you. Yes, I've been holding your grains, but at least this one thing is positive. There was no crops this year. Okay, we're all eating, right? We can't rely on that.
No, that grain reserve comment you made is really important. Right now, they're the same as they were 4 or 5 years ago, and in 2015, there were stories out that the national grain reserves have apparently vanished. Gone. This is 4 or 5 years ago, primarily due to deregulation, global markets, globalization, and then, which you mentioned, the 1996 abolishment of our national system of holding grain in reserve. That was given up in 1996 under the Clintons. And the grain was gradually depleted.
Sure somebody made a pretty penny on that one.
Oh, lots of them. The grain then was gradually depleted until 2008 when the USDA decided to convert all of what was left into dollars. So it's gone. We have no national food bank, so to speak. Not anymore. So, if you don't prepare for yourself...
Now it's called the Bill Emerson Humanitarian Trust, I believe, is what this thing turned into. So, But we can, we can do that for ourselves, and I would say we should. Outsourcing the responsibility of providing for our families, I don't think it's a good idea. I think that families should think for themselves about, hey, what happens if we can't rely on the government to deal with this? One of the things that's going on is that bankers aren't lending money now to the farms that lost everything in the last harvest because of the storms. And so these farms don't have the money to put new seeds into the ground next year. Now, look, that makes sense as a banker. But what does that mean as a country when we don't support our farms? Who's going to feed us?
All right. Exactly. We have to
do that ourselves.
We have to do it ourselves. Go back and look at that article again, and look at that sunspot number graph. It's very revealing. It's fascinating to watch it. The sun is going to sleep again, for whatever reason, or if sleep is even the right concept to lay over this. But we're flatlined right now on sunspots, 49 days without one. And just because one pops up, it doesn't mean that we're going to get out of a solar minimum. Or 2 or 3, doesn't. So there we go. Good job explaining that. I don't know where it's going, but We will find out soon enough, as they say. So you think 100 days is the big alert jump-off point?
100 days, I start paying attention. 140 days, I think we're into the Dalton. More than 150 or 60 or two stretches of 100 plus, that's the Maunder. That's what I would do as my own personal lines in the sand.
All right, very good. Spencer Feldman, thank you. Always fascinating to talk to you. Thanks very much for that.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.
You bet. All right, you be well. Take care. Spencer Feldman. All right, there's your update on the solar activity, which is zip right now in terms of sunspots. And that's our Friday night for you. Have a wonderful weekend. Take care. I'll be back Monday. In the meantime, we'll be able to listen to programming on the Rense Radio Network 24/7. So enjoy. Talk soon.